Hey folks, this is part two of chapter four, the newspaper chapter, and let's get right to it. We're talking about some of the different types of niches and trends for newspapers also. First one we're going to talk about is the penny press. There's a couple of slides on this. One of the important ones was the newspaper The Sun out of New York, started by a man named Benjamin Day in 1833. And one of the reasons it's picked is like several other newspapers of the times, they were trying to attract circulation by lowering the cost of the paper to 1 penny, 1 cent, so that members of the general public could afford to buy the newspaper. Previously, they'd been more expensive. In fact, newspapers were kind of outside the price range that most people could afford. And one of the other reasons they were able to lower the costs was this is during the time that started the Industrial Revolution. So, along with the Industrial Revolution came locomotives and train tracks, so you could distribute the paper much more quickly after it was printed, and the invention of steam printing presses. And that jumped them up from being able to print about 125 copies an hour previously to about 1,800 copies an hour. So you can imagine, I don't know how many fold extra that is, but if you're trying to sell thousands of newspapers a day, that allows you to do that, whereas under previous more mechanical printing presses, they're either hand-operated or horse-drawn, you couldn't do that. The motto of the Sun was interesting because it really explains what the penny press was all about. And the motto that was quoted in the newspaper was, "The object of this paper is to lay before the public at a price within the means of everyone all the news of the day, and at the same time offer an advantageous medium for advertisements." So they're playing into two things. Instead of just running a newspaper without very many ads, they're actively going out and intensely recruiting advertisers, and they're also intensely using technology, at least the best technology of the day, to produce papers faster and cheaper. They also focus more on mainstream readers, the kind of person that might actually buy a newspaper for a penny. Lots of human interest stories, lots of reporting off of police reports, in other words, crime, which was popular then. And you can see the design and the layout from this issue, that this was not a very attractively visual paper, but most papers were no better than this at the time. A lot of times the advertisements were embedded in the actual text, and so along the left column there you see these little sailing ships, and those were ads for passages to Scotland and other countries, and then on the interior pages there would be more ads. They didn't really have a lot of what we call display ads, the type of ads you're seeing that take up multiple columns wide and multiple inches deep in a traditional newspaper today. But by 1835, within 2 years, they were selling 15,000 copies per day of the paper, and that was a very, very healthy situation. This newspaper is dated February 17th, 1834, so this is in between that start date of 1833 and the 1835 sales date that I talked about. Somebody has written some handwritten notes at the top from 1954, and it's probably when they removed this publication from its from a bound volume and tried to discard it or sell it. So the Sun is really important to know. It's the first major paper of the penny press era. The other one to know is the New York Morning Herald, started by a man named James Gordon Bennett in 1835, just 2 years after the other guy's paper. It started off as a sensational newspaper. In other words, had all kinds of racy news and crime and some of the other things that we've come to associate with tabloid journalism. Later became more of a respected mainstream paper, just like its predecessor. Did a lot of nonpartisan political reporting. By that I mean it tried to play it straight down the middle as far as not being too opinionated, or at least giving a balance of opinion to various political parties. They did get much more aggressive, and they kind of became, they were a early 19th century newspaper that really talked and walked more like a 20th century newspaper. They got more aggressive about going after news. They hired a lot of interviewers and foreign correspondents. They basically just put a lot of pressure on people to answer questions. They were the first paper that's known of to send a reporter to a crime scene to witness an investigation. You know, in those days of journalism, a lot of times the police would hand out the news, or the government would hand out the news, and the newspapers just published it. There wasn't any real fact checking. There wasn't any real getting at the basis of whether the story was true or not. In fact, when the Civil War broke out in 1861, for that period of a civil war, the paper hired 63 war reporters to cover the war. And that's just one newspaper. Other papers had war correspondents, in particular photographers like Matthew Brady. But they went all out in covering the war, and that's why a lot of accounts of the Civil War are not based on so much on contemporaneous reporting by individual journals of soldiers as it is extreme, widely spread blanket coverage by newspaper correspondents. I thought this issue was pretty interesting because it's a issue of the Herald, dated, and it's there's a picture or a sketch of Abraham Lincoln and reporting on his death. It's an extra edition. You can see off on the fifth column or so, the headline is "The Rebels." It's reporting on the war. On the far left is talking about the assassination of President Lincoln, what happened with Secretary Seward. If you're kind of a Lincoln buff like I am, all these things were important prime material for what was being reported at the time. So this was, again, another paper that was sold for a penny, and it was a way for actual regular readers, poorer readers, to get published. And Herald made some attempts here with illustrations and things that the Sun didn't always, but at least it was some representation. Now, one slide here on the wire services. I don't know if you know what a wire is, but it's another way to gather news. The start of it is largely attributed to Samuel Morse, who people say that he invented the telegraph. It's not necessarily true. There were lots of telegraph inventors in the 1830s and 40s. In fact, Morse didn't send his first telegraph or telegram till 1844. There were others that built machines way before that. But as a result of the telegraph, news could be sent over wires hundreds of miles. Initially just dozens, but later hundreds of miles. And this helped form an organization, use of telegraph, called Associated Press, or AP, in 1846. The AP started as a collective of 5 New York newspapers: the Sun, Journal of Commerce, the Courier and Inquirer, the New York Herald, and something called Express, which I've never heard of. But it allowed newspapers to pool their stories from other papers and outside reporters. So in other words, the AP itself had reporters. The newspapers themselves had reporters. And by pooling their resources, if something happened in Baltimore later, when other newspapers joined the AP, happened in Baltimore, but it was of interest to New York readers, they would get telegraph copies of these sorts of things. The AP was also instrumental in Civil War coverage, in getting information from the battlefield actually back to the New York papers, and later on some other papers. And of course, AP later grew to include, go worldwide and include dozens and dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of newspapers. So all this collective pulling together of facts and information and trading stories increased the breadth and the depth of reporting, and it actually that led to more reliable reporting, because now you have 2 or 3 different accounts and you can cross-check them, and it allowed appeal to a wider variety of readers, because readers could read about something that happened in another city, whereas the paper in New York or the paper in Boston or the paper in Philadelphia wouldn't necessarily have the resources to send a reporter there. And this is why most even modern newspapers, their AP is still around. There have been other wire services. One was Agence France Presse. Reuters is still around. There's been a number of them. There's down to a couple, three now. But because, for example, the Wichita Eagle can't afford to necessarily have a reporter in Los Angeles and Washington and New York and other cities, Dallas, they rely on Associated Press reporters and member newspapers to get those stories so they can put what might be of interest to Wichita readers in the Wichita paper. The drawback to using the telegraphs is that, and I may hit this on another slide, I've forgotten, is that when people wanted to, the generals were also, in the president's office, were also using telegraphy to send information back and forth about troop movements and where generals should go fight next and all that. And a lot of time, soldiers on both sides of the Civil War would cut telegraph wires in order for those plans not to be sent. And of course, when they did that, they were also cutting short the way in which newspapers can communicate. And that has to do with something I'll talk about called the inverted pyramid method of writing here in a bit. So I got 4 slides on what was called yellow journalism. It's one of the more fascinating periods in journalism, and to some extent people will argue that it continues today in the form of some of the more scandalous tabloids and things like that. The 2 main players in yellow journalism are Joseph Pulitzer, who started the Pulitzer Prizes, and William Randolph Hearst, who was a publisher who started in New York but actually ended up in California and is well known for a number of reasons. The New York World was founded by Joseph Pulitzer in the late 1800s, and he was responsible, along with others, for developing a new journalism style that later wasn't called sensationalism, but later has been shown to be sensationalism. The stories often focused on crime, violence, emotional appeals, and sex. They use all kinds of lurid headlines to sell more papers. The 2 mentioned in your chapter are Baptized in Blood and Little Lotta's Lovers. And you can see the illustration on the right from an issue of the World is that suicides off the Brooklyn Bridge weren't really news, but just look at the language associated with this story. This is an old broadsheet newspaper, which means it's extremely large in size. Woman jumps from Brooklyn Bridge, survives mad leap. Money gone and loans, she's determined to die. And then it says this illustration of her flying off the bridge wearing her 19th century garb. And then they have a fist fight, and then they have a lot of coverage of baseball. So later on, you started getting these scandalous tabloids like the National Enquirer and even today's New York Post, where you're never quite sure how much truth there is and how much of it is sensational headlines and things. It's stuff like, Madonna has alien baby or Hillary Clinton has evil twin baby or something like that. Just name it. You've probably read it in the tabs. So on the one hand, even though some of the coverage involving women especially was sensationalized, they were credited. You can credit the World with coming with more coverage of women's issues. They actually started writing about women's health and women in politics and a few other things, and there was often a sensational aspect to that, but at least they opened up some of those issues for readers to see, whereas previously newspapers didn't write much about women. They didn't much care. And ironically, Pulitzer, who's associated with sensationalism, yellow journalism, is credited with and created and founded the Pulitzer Prize for Best Fiction, newspapers, poetry, and things like that. So there are some who say that he felt guilty later in his life about having done that. I believe the Pulitzers were created about 100 years ago, and they're administered through, I think, Columbia University in New York. And that he kind of had remorse for doing this, and so he founded the Pulitzer to reward the best journalism and some other things. So I don't know if that's true, but it's a nice story. Maybe you can look at it sometime. William Randolph Hearst is one of the other big practitioners of yellow journalism, with New York Journal, started at about 1895. Uh, and Hearst and Pulitzer were in this constant battle to outdo each other. They used a lot of the same sensational techniques. Each cut their papers to 1 cent also, so they were both members of the penny press for a while. They stole reporters and editors from each other. One of the most interesting and important things that Hearst was involved in, and Pulitzer did the same thing, but not as much as Hearst, was this sensationalizing the Spanish-American War at the end of the 19th century, making up facts, telling bloody stories that never happened, having illustrations in the paper that were made up. Frederick Remington, who was an artist and at the time a sketch artist, worked for Hearst and was sent down there to sketch the battle for the destruction. I mean, the battle over the USS Maine, which was destroyed when it was blown up somehow, supposedly by the Spanish. And he wired back to Hearst, and basically saying, "Hey, there's nothing to sketch here. There's nothing to draw. Nothing's happening. This thing you're telling me is this bloody battle doesn't exist." And Hearst reputedly sent back a telegram to Frederick Remington, who said, I'll provide the war, you provide the illustrations." So that just told you the kind of mind frame that a lot of these sensational publishers were. And now if you look at this sample of the New York Journal, it's from this time frame here. And again, a lot of things they're talking about just turned out not to be true. It says destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy. Assistant Secretary Teddy Roosevelt, convinced the explosion of the warship is not an accident. And then there's 3 places on that front page where the paper itself offers a $50,000 reward. That's a lot of money for information about who set off the war. And then there's all these other kind of illustrations and things. And near the bottom of the page, it's more headline than it is story. The fact of the matter is that they determined after not too long that there was some kind of a problem with static electricity inside the ship, which was anchored, I believe, near Cuba, and that the explosion was totally accidental. It was natural causes, essentially, and there was no war that started. There was no enemy or anything like that. But, there's an old saying, never let the facts get in the way of a good story. And this was a prime example where they didn't want to let the facts get in the way of a good story. Hearst also was kind of interesting. He was the model for the publisher in the movie Citizen Kane, which came out in 1941. And a lot of critics put it at the very top of their list of the best film ever made. So it was Orson Welles was the filmmaker who did the film. He also was in the film. It's really worth seeing. If nothing else, when you see it, you'll be able to ask people if they know what Rosebud is, and you will know, and they probably won't. Another thing that's really not on this slide, but it's just kind of a fun fact, I guess. His granddaughter, Patty Hearst, in the my brain's fading. In the 1970s, she joined a cult terrorism group called the Symbionese Liberation Army, and a very famous photograph of her holding a automatic weapon and wearing a beret was circulated. She was involved in a bank robbery along with some other people. She got caught, and she was the granddaughter of Hearst, and of course, just that fact alone made her newsworthy. But a nice kind of little ending to the Hearst story. Another thing worth mentioning in the third or the fourth slides that I'm doing for Lonely Yellow Journalism is a comic, believe it or not, called The Yellow Kid. I bet none of you have ever heard of this, but Hearst started publishing it in his paper, The Journal, in 1896. R.F. Occult was the person who created it, drew it, wrote it. And if you look at this example, you can see it is written in non-grammatical, what we call dialect language. and this was an attempt to attract immigrant readers who might not have bought a regular English Latin or language newspaper. Of course, it also cost a penny. So what the Yellow Kid was this goofy-looking guy. I can't tell if he's a boy or a small man, had big ears, who was always wearing a yellow nightshirt. In this example, he's smoking a cigar. And he's, like I say, the writing on it is, sometimes they're making fun of the pompous or tycoons, but usually just plain old fun, whimsical gag type illustration. It says, say, this is me official cigar, what I does me tricks wit. See me smoking with me ears. And of course, there's smoke coming through his ears. Now, it was very popular in the 19th century also for African American dialect, sort of slave dialect, to be used in humor books and later on in movies, and there's sort of those stereotypical racial things that we expect from certain races, whether it's African American or French people talking in snooty French, or Irish workers talking about getting drunk, or whatever you might think of, or the way Hispanic people have been stereotyped and had racist stuff written in their own dialect because it's essentially broken English. But this appealed to the readership there at that time. For the time, it was considered very funny. It spawned all kinds of buttons and ladies' fans, cracker tins, cigarette packs, and other merchandise. So people, it was kind of like, something, I'm trying to think of a good example right now, something that's really popular that, you might think of it as like a political button or something like that, except that it's funny. It's not politics. This actually, the term sensational journalism is frequently called yellow journalism. And the reason why is because this character always wore a bright, it says bring, but it should be bright yellow nightshirt. And then people started calling sensational journalism yellow journalism. So if you ever want to know where the term comes from, that's it. And if you get on the web and play around, if you just search for the Yellow Kid, there's tons of this stuff on there, and some of it's pretty funny, some of it's pretty lame. But anyway, and my next click is, I seem to have lost control of my cursor here. Hello, 1, 2, 3. What happened? Okay, are we still talking? We had a long delay there. The mouse on my computer quit working. The fourth screen on yellow journalism, I've just called in the textbook called stunt journalism. The main practitioner of this was a woman named Elizabeth Cochran, who changed her name to Nellie Bly. And sometimes she spelled it I-E, sometimes she spelled it L-Y. But her first big scoop was to infiltrate the New York City lunatic asylum. And when she came out, she wrote a book about that experience called 10 Days in a Madhouse. It was an expose about the horrible conditions inside this lunatic asylum. It came out in 1887. And what she was trying to show was the people living there weren't being fed, they were full of disease, they weren't being given clothes or water. They were beaten, and it's actually a really horrible account of the way people inside the asylum were treated. In order to gain asylum, she had to fake being crazy, and so she was able to do that. A couple years later, she was sent on a trip around the world and did it in 72 days. And there's a popular movie called Around the World in 80 Days or something that was based on her voyage. And so she got its reputation, got famous for doing these types of stories, these sort of stunt types of stories. It brought her a lot of notoriety, some so-called serious journalists were criticizing, and some members of the public, the highbrow establishment, were criticizing her for sensationalism as what they thought was lowbrow entertainment. It'd be kind of like, doing an expose on. I think the expose work was probably legitimate journalism, but she did a series of stunts like this where she, climbed a tower or something like that, or went around the world, and they thought that was just pretty cheap entertainment, much like we might think of a sitcom on TV nowadays. That's kind of low rent entertainment. Well, that's the end of part 2. You made it through alive. We've got one more part to go. And I think before I pass on to the next part, I'm going to make you an offer. I want to see if people are paying attention to these videos. So the first 2 students who send me an email, whenever you're at this point, send me an email saying, I want my coffee. I will give you a Starbucks gift card. And if you're not in Wichita, that's fine. I'll mail it to you. You just have to provide me a mailing address. So I will give Starbucks gift cards to the first 2 people who email me, I want my coffee. And include your name and your address so I can get it to you. Or if you're here on Wichita campus, you can come by and pick it up. How's that? We'll go on to part 3 now.